Of unconstrained vacant residential industrial land and future comp plan update. So very heady work session. I think I'll turn it over to you, Scott.
Great, thank you, Mayor and Council. For your St. Patrick's Day evening entertainment, we have a robust work session for you. I'm going to introduce to you Don Hardy, our planning director. I believe some of you have met Mr. Hardy, but I don't believe all of you, or some of you may have briefly interacted with Don. So this will be his first presentation to the council. Don, as I think you know, started with us just after the first of the calendar year as our new planning director, and he's doing a great job for us. So I'm going to turn it over to Don. He's going to provide updates on the implementation of the legislation that the mayor mentioned pertaining to housing. And he's also going to review our available unconstrained residential and industrial lands. He'll have a slideshow presentation, but we'll leave lots of time for questions and discussion that you may have on this topic. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Planning Director Don Hardy.
Thank you, Scott, and good evening, Mayor Hudson and council members. Glad to be here tonight with you and to discuss House Bill 2001 and 2003, as well as an overview of the vacant buildable lands piece that we're working on as part of our ongoing work here at the Planning Department. I wanted to start out tonight with that this will be a high-level overview, and we're not expecting any policy decisions from council tonight on this, but this is more informational. There will be other work sessions occurring as well on this as we continue to go forward. But I did want to give an update, and they do tie in pretty nicely. The Housing Bill 2001 and 2003 kind of ties in nicely with, you know, what's left in inventory for residential. And then also I figured we should talk about industrial land as well. And then how does that all fit into ultimately a comprehensive plan update for the city? There you go. Thank you. So I covered that slide. Wanted to start out with House Bill 2001, Housing Choices. This is really the duplex bill that has become effective. Oregon State has adopted an administrative rule around this. This is really intended to apply to cities to help promote affordable housing, and trying to build kind of a thumbnail around this. There's a lot of literature regarding this, but I'm going to try to boil it down into its essence and what impacts this may have for the city and what opportunities this may have for the city. It is state law, as I mentioned. It will become effective July 1, 2021, and it is intended to apply to only areas in the city that are zoned single-family detached homes. That is in the R1 zone, the low-density zone, residential zone in the city of Canby. And in essence, it allows for the opportunity to have a duplex on the same lot as you would have on a lot that's zoned single-family residential. There are large cities and medium cities that this applies to. The city of Canby is a medium city between 10,000 and 25,000 population. What that kind of means in general is the standards are a little less aggressive. Large cities like the city of Portland have much more aspirational goals to fulfill. The issue that kind of the main part of this that I was going to talk on is the medium city model ordinance piece of this, which has come out from the state. And the model ordinance essentially is a standard that is the minimum standard for cities to implement, and this will become effective July 1. If the city does nothing, essentially the model ordinance is the standard. And that's the minimum standard. The city can be more liberal and actually create more liberal standards, but the model ordinance is the minimum.
Don, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we're not seeing or at least I'm not seeing the slides progressing. So okay. I don't know if we're still on slide number 1.
Okay, sorry. And just give us a moment here. you seeing that now? Is that slide? Are you guys seeing the slide that's up now? Where does it apply?
Yes, sir, we are.
Okay, great. Sorry about the last slide. And I can go back over that if you'd like. Would you guys like to go back over that prior slide? Okay, you're good. So like I said, it applies in the low density residential zone. It is a voluntary measure only, and it's not a requirement. But it's a measure that somebody could take advantage of. Is that slide up now? Will neighborhood be impacted? Okay, you're seeing that. Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So in terms of like, what does this really all mean for the city? We're a little uncertain, how frequently this would be used in the city. And part of that is related to people's willingness to do that on their lots. Part of this is in relation to the development code standards that they would have to meet to be able to achieve this. And just for example, if you're looking at what kind of a lot size you would have to even contemplate putting a duplex on a single family low density residential zone lot, there's all kinds of different configurations of lots, but pretty much a common maybe way of looking at this would be looking at 100 by 100 foot lot, 10,000 square feet. That, in my opinion, probably would be the minimum lot that you'd end up needing in terms of a lot size to be able to even accommodate this kind of a situation, given the fact that there's a 20-foot front yard setback in that zone and a 10 to 15-foot rear yard setback in that zone. And so it depends on the configuration of your home and how you would build it. But if you had a home that's say 30 by 60 as your single family residential home in the front half of your property, depending on where it was located, and then you built a 30 by 50 duplex in the back of that, it would be really tight to put that on your property. There'd be very little room left if you do the math on that. Now that's one possible configuration there, but my belief is that this would not apply universally to every single lot in the city, and basically the underlying zoning standards the city has will still be in play that would pertain to the single family lot, the single family zone lot for both the single family detached home and the duplex. So part of that is that's more of the dimensional standard piece of this. The other part is this is an uncommon thing in the market, has not really been tested, but I wanted to give you a comparison to what we're seeing for accessory dwelling units in the city. There's very few applications we're seeing each year. I know it's not a one-to-one comparison, but we do allow 800 square feet for an accessory dwelling unit in addition to a single family home on a lot. And again, we're only seeing a few of these, maybe a two per year. So we're not seeing a great demand here. It doesn't mean people won't apply to do a duplex, but it's going to take pretty unique circumstances, I think, for that to happen. And so I think part of what we'd like to do in our process here is just continue to monitor this and report back to council on what we're seeing in that situation. And that's really kind of our main thought for right now on that piece of it. So I was going to advance to the next slide, which is next steps, which again kind of goes back to when this becomes effective, July 1, 2021. And the city would end up needing to also, I think, put this into a codified form. So the model ordinance is a little chunky. It's not like written as well as our city code is. And so we'd want to, I think, put it into the code so it actually translates better than looking at the model code. But we'd anticipate updating the city code to reflect the model code in 2021. And with that, I was going to ask if you had questions.
Hey, Don.
Yeah.
Maybe I could ask a question if they're not going to ask one.
Sure.
When you spoke with the LCD folks, there was discussion on whether somebody could do a duplex and a ADU, and they might be interested in the fact of that.
That's a great question. So thank you, Joe. So I think that one of those items that is really important is there's only 2 homes on one lot permitted, not 3. So Your options are single-family dwelling, accessory dwelling unit, option 1, option 2, single-family home and duplex. You cannot have 3 on one lot. So thank you. That was really important. And so that's probably really the premise. And the other zones in the city, the R15 and the R2 already permit that more than one house on a lot. Therefore, they're not really in play here. It's really the single-family low-density residential zone that this applies to. Does that all make sense to you guys? And so really, I mean, that's mainly to give you an update on this. I mean, this is, again, kind of trying to address the housing affordability situation. And I think it's part of maybe a toolbox item. I think there's more to the toolbox that I'll be talking about next in House Bill 2003, Housing Needs Assessment, which I think is a little more global and expansive in its application. So if you guys don't have any, if you don't have any further questions, I'll launch into the next round of this.
Brian?
Yes, Councilor Parker.
My suggestion, based upon how we've behaved in the past once we get started with questions, would be for you to finish your prepared presentation, and then if there is time, we have questions. We could burn up the rest of the hour with our questions. I've got a couple here myself, but Brian, that would be my suggestion.
All right, that sounds good to me, Councilor Parker. Then, yeah, Don, if you want to just go ahead and finish, and we'll go from there.
Sounds good. I'm going to go ahead and go into House Bill 2003, housing needs and production. And this, again, is something that I know you guys are familiar with, having seen the draft of the housing needs assessment in September 2019. Again, this is another tool item that the state is using to create a balanced housing supply within communities. That's the intent. It regulates for those cities over 10,000 population, and it requires cities to identify strategies for housing affordability. And those strategies can be broad brush. They can be zoning development standards, or they can be reduction in fees or other measures to promote housing affordability. It's a pretty big box that could be used there for those items. There's a little longer lead time on this. The adoption of the housing needs assessment is required by December 2022. The housing needs assessment will be used, that was done, the draft that you've seen already will be used as a base for updating this. And there are informational pieces that do need to be updated in that September 2019, as it's been about a year and a half. The vacant land piece of that needs to be updated, as well as probably some of the demographics regarding housing populations and housing affordability. So the housing affordability strategies are intended, again, to address those broad brush throughout the entire community. And there's two pieces to the housing needs assessment. There's a housing needs assessment, which is kind of the strategy piece of this. And then there's a housing production strategy, which is a separate item that's also required a year later after the adoption of the housing needs assessment. They can be combined, and some jurisdictions have done that. They've combined the two of them. It's not required to combine them, but they can be combined. I think there does need to be a link for the housing needs assessment. So when we do the strategies, that should really mirror what those should mirror what we're going to be doing for the housing production implementation, so that they are consistent. So there's not a disconnect between those. So there would have to be some tie-in to both those as part of that. There is an advantage to the timing, I think, in some ways here for House Bill 2003 related to the comprehensive plan, the anticipated comprehensive plan update that I'd like to also see. I'm going to touch on that as I get into the presentation a little further. But I think there is some opportunities here to be kind of looking at this holistically. There's a lot of things in the city that have changed since the comprehensive plan was last fully adopted and implemented. And I'll go through that a little bit more. But I think there's a good opportunity for us to look at things concurrently as we're doing the housing needs assessment and the comprehensive plan. Hopefully it would be a parallel effort. And the next steps on this will be coming back to council. I'm anticipating summer, fall 2021 to address housing policy considerations. This is something that I think is an iterative process that I think is important to absolutely, go through this process, step by step. It's somewhat complicated to go through this, but like I said, there are some opportunities as we get into the comp plan, and I'm going to proceed ahead with that. So the next item is vacant residential and employment lands. And this will be really kind of a high level assessment here. I wanted to have our staff take a look at what we have globally, high level, and this kind of is what I'm talking about, unconstrained lands. Those would be lands that are free, that do not contain floodplains or environmentally constrained areas. They would not contain schools and parks. They would not contain the Willamette Valley Golf Course. And again, this is a little bit of like pragmatic kind of looking at this from the perspective of what is our base. The Department of Land Conservation and Development looks at things slightly differently. So when we get into the housing needs assessment, my understanding is the Willamette Valley Golf Course actually is considered as part of our inventory for housing, even though it's a golf course, because it's zoned single family residential R1. I'm trying to look at this more from the perspective of like what the city has left if you exclude those things that I think are already committed to other uses and you remove those, where are we going and what's the land supply looking like? So with that, I've looked at two things, both within the city, acreage in the city, and then acreage within the urban growth boundary. So the first one is residential vacant, and that's all categories. That's R1, R1.5, and R2, and there's about 100 acres of R1, 5 acres of R1.5, and about 19 acres of R2. And then low density residential zoning in the urban growth boundary, not in the city, there's about 155 acres in that category as well. Then we're moving to the medium and high density residential. It's about 193 acres, and most of that is in special area J that's in the comp plan, which is in the northeast corner of the city in an area that would need a development concept plan and to be annexed into the city, but that's where most of that acreage is. And then with the industrial within the city, there's roughly about 151 acres in the city. In industrial within the urban growth boundary outside of the city, about 15 acres. So we are trying to get a grasp on how much consumption of land is occurring each year on residential and industrial lands. And we look back to our inventory of what we've seen in the application that are in process. And it's roughly about 88 acres of year of residential land that's being consumed. And that cross-checked actually with the housing needs assessment that was done previously as well. So I kind of compared those numbers. That 88 acres is roughly a year to a year and a half, plus or minus that kind of time period where 88 acres is generally being consumed. And if that pattern continues going forward, I was looking at how much land is available. And if we fast forward that and we look at our base, which includes the area in the city and the area in the urban growth boundary, there's about a 5.5 year supply, which seems like a lot, but it's not as much as the state typically looks at comprehensive plans that have a 20-year supply of housing. And so in comparison, that is not a huge amount of land available for the future. I did want to point out that we do, as part of this process, the 53 acres that I'm looking at that you see in the middle point there, that's anticipated in the near term as an annexation based on conversations we've had. There's some other property that will likely come into the city that has not yet been fully submitted to the city yet, but I wanted to point that out. So shifting to the rate of industrial consumption, we're looking roughly based on our trends, again, about 50 acres per year. And based on the supply within the city and within the urban growth boundary, there's roughly about 3.5 year supply of industrial land available. So that just kind of gives a yardstick for going forward in terms of our planning. There's a couple things that we will be doing this year, over this next year, and the housing needs assessment, again, the due date for that is December 2022, but we will be working on the housing needs assessment update over this next year. There's also an economic opportunity assessment that we received a grant from DLCD on. That will talk about employment lands and what's needed for employment within the city. Those will dovetail into our assessment of what lands are essentially are needed within the city, and what aspirationally we should have, at least for the employment side of things. It would definitely be part of that economic opportunity assessment. So kind of fast forwarding where this all goes next, we're anticipating that the comprehensive plan should be, and the transportation system plan should be the next items that are updated. As part of the, just to keep ahead of what we're doing here on our forecast, it also works nicely with the housing needs assessment work that would parallel, and there would be some overlap in that information, especially the vacant buildable lands piece for the housing needs assessment would be a nice transition as information we could use for the comprehensive plan update. Aspirationally, I'd like to target the comprehensive plan and the transportation system plan updates from 2022 to 2024. And again, the comprehensive plan that we currently have, although it has a date of 2019 on it, if you look into the interior of the document, the projections were really through 2000. So it's dated. I think that was largely the 1984 plan that was forecasting to 2000. Although there were some updates to it and removing some special areas that are part of that 2019 plan. And then the last transportation system plan was in December 2010. So again, that's somewhat dated as well. So I think this would really give us the opportunity, I think, to look at housing globally, employment lands globally, what the city wants to do as a policy in terms of possibly expansion of urban lands. That would definitely be in consideration here. There would need to be justification for that through the Department of Land Conservation and Development. But I think at a minimum, it would be good to have a more fresh comprehensive plan and transportation system plan to address the increasing development that we're having and how we're reacting to that development. We're seeing a lot of transportation in particular. I think that's what you see in a growing community, is how do you keep up with all that and how do you prioritize it? So those are some items there. And with that, I'm ready now for your input.
Great, thanks, Don. I appreciate that very much. Yeah, it's a lot of information to whittle down to what it was, and yeah, we've been talking about the intensity of this particular conversation in terms of our comp plan coming up, and this, I think, lays that out pretty well. Councilor Parker, did you want to start off with your questions?
Actually, I'll go last because I've got a couple and I want to make sure everybody has a chance.
Okay. Councilor Bangs, you were waving your hand earlier. Did you have a couple of questions?
I had a question that I think was addressed. I honestly don't remember what the question was, but I am curious to know if our city's growth rate is similar to similar sized cities. Do we grow in Canby faster than our neighbors do, or slower? Is this growth rate normal?
I think, to answer the question, there's several ways to look at the growth, and a lot of times the projection for housing needs assessment is in terms of percentage of growth of population change. I don't think it's excessive. I think it's pretty comparable in growth rate. My yardstick was more about acreage, which I think from a planning perspective helps us better to quantify that versus some more theoretical, like you have this much population you have to capture and absorb, and it's more of an academic exercise in that sense. So I think it's a pretty standard growth rate. for Canby. I don't think it's in the excessive range. I've talked to Department of Land Conservation and Development. But we are consistently growing though, and that's the one thing that's happening. And that pattern, I think, has been really in place for probably 5 years.
Is that something that we can control and correct me please if I'm wrong, because I don't really know a lot about this, but it strikes me that the state came in and told us that we had to change our zoning, and the state took away our authority to annex new lands. What is it that we can control here?
I think the main thing that the city has the ability to control is the type and quality of developments that are happening here. The city can choose to look at things, you know, like how much employment land do we want to have? There's a policy decision issues related to that. The state is giving us a lot of guidance, I would agree, on housing, and it does feel like sometimes that's more directive perhaps than the way the cities want to operate more autonomously. But I think the main thing that really the issues are the quality and type and the character of we can control those things to the extent that we put regulations in. We have regulatory authority over level of service issues, those kinds of things. We have that authority. We have regulatory authority over design consideration and how things look. So those are things we can control.
Hey, one thing I'm wondering if we can control is the volume. Everything was perfect until just now, and now you're pulsing in and out, so we can only hear part of what you're saying. Is there a microphone that got moved or something?
Is that better?
Well, we just heard what you said clearly.
Okay.
So that was good.
Okay.
And I'm not asking you to repeat it. I really appreciate your answer. I did catch it. Thank you.
So, Don, going back to the issue of, I guess, duplexes on single-family homes or in single-family developments like that. Again, so if we leave it alone as is, can someone go into Tofty Farms, buy up one of the homes there, tear it down, and put it in a duplex?
You would need a single family home on the lot and a duplex. In order to get the duplex, you got to have a single family home on the lot.
Okay, so you can't tear down a single family home to put in a duplex.
If it was on one lot, you could do that, but you know.
Okay, I guess that's what I'm asking is.
Yep.
You know, my lot's a little over 10,000 square feet. You know, so if I wanted to turn it into a duplex property, based on the minimum ordinance or language, I could, if I laid it out correctly, I could totally do that.
You could. Now, the one thing I did not touch base on, which I believe probably is in play in many of the new subdivisions, is covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which may prohibit a duplex going in there.
You're cutting out again, Don.
Okay, sorry. Is that better?
We'll let you know as you talk.
Okay. So one thing that would be possibly in play here for newer subdivisions is covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which am I not?
It's not better.
Do we have a microphone issue there, gang? This was kind of happening at the last meeting as well.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
It was crystal clear during your slide presentation,
Okay.
then something happened during the Q&A.
Can't hear you, Don.
How about here? Better?
Well, I suppose
We
Better?
won't really know until you start talking for any
Okay.
extended period of time because
Okay. So let me try again. So the newer subdivisions, there are covenants, conditions, likely covenants, conditions, and restrictions in those areas. It probably would end up eliminating or possibly eliminating duplexes being allowed on those lots. I don't know what those are.
okay.
But as this goes forward into July 2021, there will be a prohibition for people doing that to put it in covenants, conditions, and restrictions going forward. That doesn't completely answer your question, but I'm guessing that in those high-end residential subdivisions, given the opportunity for covenants, conditions, and restrictions, it's likely that that would be in play.
Yeah, I again, when this was being crafted, my guess or I think the intent wasn't for neighborhoods like for Canby, it'd be like Tofty Farms or Valley Farms or areas like that. I think it was more designed in pockets of Portland where there are those areas that might be like I don't see this happening in the Laurelhurst neighborhood of Portland or whatnot, but it is something that had me, still does, concerned in terms of how housing gets developed. I mean, if there's, to me, it would be council and or the city creating those policies and whatnot regarding zoning and where we want development like that density put into place. I mean, Canby's already been touted as probably one of the more densely populated cities in Oregon. And as we have those infill pieces starting to occur, you talk about annexations and whatnot. It's going to be a potential conversation. I know we've got a developer that's interested just off of the kind of downtown area there by the fairgrounds that I think wants to, take down 2 homes and put in 4 based on a kind of a duplex model, I think, so, or even more. So it is something that is going to play into our housing mix. We just, I think, need to be careful and constructive in how we go about doing that. So, Councilor Spoon?
Yeah, thanks, Mayor. A couple of questions. First, just for clarity, you said that there was 193 acres currently within the UGB, and you said it's in the northeast corner of the city. But since you didn't have the maps, I can't recall where that is. Can you?
It's in the industrial, the new industrial road connector. It's right. That goes right through the middle of it. So the ESP modification, that's about right in the center of that area.
Gotcha. Now I think of northeast as like where Wayside is, so I was trying to figure that out. Thank you so much. My actual question is when it comes to the Senate bill and the House bill that preclude us from voting on annexations, where annexations, if they are not fingers and if they're attached, are kind of, we're not really allowed to say no to them, but we can decide how they're zoned. One of the provisions of that legislation is that if we're unable to manage the infrastructure, if we really can't support it, we do not have to allow the annexation, but that's kind of our only out. Does this law, considering my thought is that considering that a lot of these neighborhoods were built with sewer lines and infrastructure based around an anticipated number of residents, but in a case where they might go through and double in some cases or even triple the number of residents, is there any provision in the legislation that allows us to disallow development if our infrastructure cannot support the additional residences?
In our code, that's clearly the case, that if we can't support it, it's not going to happen. I mean, that's clearly something that we have identified in our code.
Okay, and the legislation doesn't supersede that?
No, I mean, we have to have capacity, sewer and water capacity, and for that. But just as a maybe a parallel thought process to that is there are some opportunities in some of the that area that I was talking about where the industrial connector goes through. There's some of the property owners that may be interested in more residential component of that, which actually is called out in the comprehensive plan in area J as being medium and higher density. So I think the counter to that may be that there are opportunities as that comp plan goes goes through its process to look at that as to locational issues where it may be thought to be more in line with the comp plan and perhaps more in line with the thought process of where that should be located.
I'm not hearing you, Don.
You're not hearing me? Okay. How about now?
Did I catch one of the things you said? You were going in and out, was that because CCNRs in a neighborhood, the codes, covenants, and restrictions in a neighborhood can preclude a certain housing type, that you think, and I just couldn't hear you right. Is this what I heard, that moving into July, there might be a rush in neighborhoods to create CCNRs where they don't exist, or to re-clarify them to preclude? Is that what you said, or did I mishear you?
I would say that there probably would not be a rush, because I think people that do subdivisions would probably automatically put them in place.
Right, but in older subdivisions where they may not exist or they may not have addressed this particular.
Someone could, theoretically lobby their neighbors and do that too.
Okay.
That would require a fairly robust thing for
Yes,
those.
it would, for sure. Thanks.
Is it possible that we get some tech support on the audio issue? Because I know it's not your fault, and it happened to us 2 weeks ago. Only from the city feed. It's not like everybody else on the council I can hear clearly still.
Is it maybe as simple as just swapping out that microphone and putting a different microphone there?
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's done. It's when you're talking and it goes more than about 10 seconds, then it starts to pulsate. It's not anything that you're doing. You're talking fine. It's just how the microphone's picking you up. And so it'll like slowly fade out into where the last quarter of your answer, I feel like one of my, older residents that needs to turn up his hearing aid.
I'll continue to try to answer your questions. Hopefully you can hear parts of what I'm saying.
Yeah, we know that the CCNR piece is going to be a big deal, especially as new subdivisions come online and those become a big part of that. And I know that Councilor Spoon, being a realtor, can probably attest to how many of her clients have actually read the CCNRs before they buy their homes. When I was in the mortgage industry, I don't think I had a single one read CCNRs. They just signed it and moved on. But I think that
sometimes they can make sure they can have their dog there, but that's about as far as they read.
dogs and in Canby chicken coops, and can I later turn my property into a rental? So I think that that's something that if we don't see that, that could be something down the road with new subdivisions. Councilor Parker?
Thank you, and we're glad to have you here.
Thank you.
Couple of things real quick. The employment lands, as you call that, we really need to have a separate discussion about that. When the Canby Pioneer Industrial Park was designed and developed, it wasn't about jobs, Mike Jordan told me. It was all about having high value property so that homeowners didn't have to pay for all of services. Now we're in a situation where all of the jobs going into the industrial park are being paid less than what a person can afford to rent a place in. You'd need to be making $22 an hour in order to be able to afford an apartment in Canby. So we need to have a discussion about employment lands and what that means. Councillor Bangs made the reference to growth. I want to shut down this boogeyman, and I'll need your updated numbers, and we'll probably get some better ones in a year with the new census. But the adjusted Portland State University numbers, I think, went from a growth rate in Canby of 3.2 to 1.9. So actually, the Canby growth rate is dropping in terms of population, but we've got a disconnect between housing growth and population. That we have more people moving in and buying 2,300 square foot houses with one or two people. Also, double check the number for me, but I think last I heard we were putting in about 200 houses a year, which I think is kind of capacity. So the idea that we've got unbridled growth going on, I just want to put an asterisk on that. I want to make sure you've got enough resources for this. We went through a planning situation a couple of years ago where once planning requests came in for permits, our long-range planning shut down. The lights dimmed, and nothing else was done other than just process papers. And I don't want that to happen. So if we need to bring on somebody on a temporary assignment, hire a consultant, hire a firm, we need to get this comp plan done. For you new counselors, when you stay up until midnight with a appeal on a land use issue because our code is so confusing, you'll appreciate why we need to tackle it big with lots of resources and get this sucker wrestled to the ground. And then finally, yes, I like your idea about taking the country club out of the housing inventory. And I also think the Clackamas County Fairgrounds are zone 1.5, and I think it may be included as well. But yes, we need numbers that are real, not based on something else. So thank you, Mayor.
Yeah, if I can piggyback on that too, Greg, and I appreciate that piece. When we had this conversation, oh gosh, maybe 4 years ago, in talking about the comp plan and talking about both the fairgrounds and the country club. So when we look at, because the conversation came up about, well, what happens when, all those lands that are available to be annexed or annexed in, and like you said, with 5.5 year build out, when we should be closer to double that or triple that, we can't petition and go to the state to expand our urban growth boundary until we hit a certain saturation point. And as long as the country club is considered R1, and right now is just viewed as a green space, and then we've got the fairgrounds within our city limits, though it's county, and that's considered 1.5, the alphabet soup of the land boards consider that buildable land still. And though we may totally build out all available lands except those two big parcels, they could still view that as buildable lands, and therefore no to expanding your UGB, and therefore bringing development to a halt, at least from a spread wise. And then it becomes more about going vertical than it means going out, if you want to bring in more residents and more upright housing. So that is the piece of a huge, two big aspects to this conversation that will need to be dealt with. And as Greg said, trying to get that removed in terms of that dialogue. I mean, yeah. So did you want to add something, Councilor Parker?
Well, you did a good job of painting down the road where this could be a big deal in terms of us trying to do some development and having these bad numbers. The other thing is that every time we go through our buildable lands numbers, we have to subtract 2 asterisks. And, if there's some place that we need to stick that information, fine. But what I'm hoping that you will help us provide in the next couple of years, sooner than later, the city administration sent out an email just late today indicating some additional federal funds are coming. But I would rather, Jordan, isn't the term overpower with resources? That we lived just recently through a situation where all of our long-range planning stopped. It was just terrible. And everybody was just passing around planning applications and permits. It was awful for a city that had a reputation for excellent long-range planning. So you've got my support for coming in and asking for a bunch of money to get this done.
Thank you.
Yes, Councilor Banks.
Real quickly, Mr. Mayor, I find it fascinating that our fairgrounds, which isn't really even ours, and the country club are included in that available land. I'm just curious, the school district must be the largest landowner in town. Does that not exist, that problem with the school district?
No.
Okay, good.
Yeah, no, in fact, it's interesting because over by the Timber Ridge, Timber Park development, there's
Timber Estates.
What's that?
Timber Estates.
That'll work too. There's a back portion of that I think is still owned by Canby School District or that kind of got, not sure the school district is planning with that, but yeah, they are the largest landowner and their lands don't play into this equation, correct, Don?
Yes, I mean, public, that would be the same as if the school district owns that, you're right, you're correct.
Okay. Yeah, so it was funny, last night at the Parks meeting, I suppose if it ever comes about, and that's the challenge when you look at, I'm not sure how the ownership of the country club is, who owns that or whatnot, but if the decision is ever made to then sell that off and turn it into single family homes, yeah, that would be a huge, that'd be a huge planning session that ones I think that we've not ever seen before. Councillor Varwig or Councillor Hensley or Tibbles, any questions at all?
I don't have any.
Mine have been pretty good from others. Thank you.
Okay. Don, is this, how does the conversation about urban and rural reserve play into this? Though I know that there's some legal battles on that whole conversation going on, but how does that play into this conversation if it stays as it's planned out or as it is?
And it's my understanding that Metro is really holding back on any of that land on the north side of the city that's in that reserve, and it's pretty much a non-touch area for the city. I think the growth, if there was an expansion for the city, would be to the south and to the east. So those are areas that are fair game. Again, back to the discussion, there'd have to be a justification for that based on growth, based on DLCD's criteria for that. But I think the stuff in the north, I think Metro is kind of holding that out as their ace in the hole, so to speak, for their other negotiations that they're dealing with when they.
Yeah, thanks, Don. That has been the conversation, and the thought of Canby's growth was and is south and to the east. The northeast portion, master planning of that whole area as industrial and or how that housing progresses towards highway commercial there along 99 is that as Walnut gets developed and that master planning piece will be a big portion of the comp plan, I'm sure, as well. Councilor Parker?
You just made me think of something. That if in fact development continues out along 99, please remember to extend the 99 beautification plan to those new areas, so that we don't just have commercial areas built up against the freeway, but our 99 plan, for example, the Fred Meyer gas station was required to put in landscaping. So again, this is a long-term thing. I'm not going to be around. Hopefully some of you will be, but as we expand on 99, let's make sure that we have a landscape development plan.
Don, you've made the transition from private sector to public sector, and we look at House Bill 2001, 2003. How do you, now that you've got this different lens going on, how do you see that impact in Canby?
I think that, Oregon's taken a pretty aggressive stance to try to address housing affordability more so than Washington. And they were asking for quite specific information on how that housing affordability will take form. And I think it's going to require the city to be quite proactive and looking at opportunities where people raise their hand and say, I'd like to take on the medium and high density residential. And then I think that part should be, how does the city facilitate that? And that could be two forms. That could be in special area J. It may even be in downtown. And those are my thoughts on that in terms of where that goes.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions or comments from anybody on these? Again, I think this is very much a dipping the toe in of what's to come and the work that needs to be done. To Councilor Parker's point, yeah, I think Don and Scott and Jamie and Ryan and that whole part of the city staff, there's a lot of work that's going to be needing to be put into this for sure. I think, yeah, we can't put on the back burner the long range planning, as Councilor Parker said, as we kind of fell behind on some of this planning stuff in terms of housing and industrial lands as well as parks pieces. So I know that we'll have to keep an eye on those pieces as well. Okay. Don, what do you need from us from this point?
Just to let you guys know, we'll be coming back to you with other items for housing considerations, and really looking forward to that input from you as we go through the housing needs assessment and the economic opportunity assessment. That's the next piece. Ultimately for the 2022 budget, which you guys are not going to be dealing with this year, obviously, but that's going to be the big ask where we're going to be looking at the comp plan and we'll look for grant opportunities there as well. But that will be a big ask for the comp plan and the transportation system plan. And just to your point about the zoning code, I really feel like those things need to get sorted first. The comp plan and the transportation system plan, and then the zoning code needs an overhaul as well. It's probably needed one for a while. And so, but I do think the housing piece needs to get sorted first so we know what we're going to be doing in our code. But those are, I would say, on the heels of the comp plan, the transportation system plan, that I would probably out 2023, 2024, there'll be probably a large overhaul for the zoning development code. In the near term, we probably will be bringing forward a number of revisions to the zoning code that are more low-hanging fruit that we'll be bringing to you for consideration.
Councilor Spoon?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I did have one more question I meant to ask earlier. You were mentioning in the first part of the presentation that the model ordinance was a little bit clunky. Is our plan to streamline that and have a cleaner ordinance, right? We're not just going to run with the model ordinance.
Exactly, and that's thank you for that.
Yeah.
That's part of that cleanup that we would absolutely want to do that. So when somebody comes to the counter, we're not trying to interpret it like so much, but it's codified, and that would be those would be the kind of things we'd bring forward to you in this coming year.
Okay. Don, thank you. Appreciate that. If there's no other questions, I'll consider our work session done here. Okay. Don, thank you. Our city council meeting will begin at 7:30. So everybody's got time to grab something to snack on, a bio break or whatever. And hopefully we can get the sound piece figured out for the city council meeting tonight.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you,
Mr.
Don. I
Mayor.
really appreciate your knowledge and your expertise.
Brian, I'm wondering if